Joining us from New York on C-SPAN's Newsmakers program is Roger Stone, a longtime Republican strategist and the author of The Making of the President 2016, How Donald Trump Orchestrated a Revolution. Thank you very much for being with us.
Great to be here. My thanks to C-SPAN for this opportunity.
And joining us with the questioning is Michael Isikoff of Yahoo News, chief investigative reporter, and Tom Liabianco, who is with the Associated Press reporter who covers politics and Washington, D.C. And Mr. Stone, let me begin with the issue of Robert Mueller. Do you suspect that he is preparing charges against the president?
Well, I believe that his inquiry is politically motivated. I think that we've seen extraordinary evidence in the last couple weeks, the tweets, the email records, the contributions to Democrats that indicate that his is a partisan hit squad. I think this is a political proceeding rather than a legal proceeding. And I have said that I believe that the president's lawyers are naive about Mr. Mueller's intentions. I think they misunderstand the deep enmity that the political establishment in both parties has for the president and their absolute resolve to remove him on any pretext whatsoever. To me, a strategy of just turning over hundreds of thousands of documents, waiving executive privilege, and relying on the innate fairness of Robert Mueller is a foolish strategy. So I think that we have to see what comes out of General Flynn's plea deal. General Flynn has said that a senior member of the president's transition team directed him to contact the Russian ambassador to set up a meeting, a perfectly legal action on General Flynn's part. So perhaps Mr. Mr. Mueller is preparing an indictment of others. It's interesting to me that if Mr. Mueller should proceed against the president or any of his associates, to me it appears that it would be some kind of process-related indictment, perjury, obstruction, nothing relating specifically to collusion with the Russians to affect the outcome of the election.
Do you think there is anything in the president's tax returns that could lead to charges?
I absolutely do not. I have long thought that perhaps the president isn't putting his tax returns out because the total income, while would be extraordinary for the rest of us, perhaps not as large as some people might expect. But if you go back to the campaign, I have long thought that the president should put his tax returns out to lay this to rest. We know that he took legitimate deductions for losses on a very large scale, but that's the tax code. If you don't like the tax code, you can change the tax code. As a savvy developer and businessman, the president has taken advantage of the perfectly legitimate tax laws in that area. But I don't think there's any business relationship with Russian entities or anything of that type.
Let me turn to Michael Isikoff of Yahoo News.
Yes. So just to follow up on the Mueller issue, you just wrote in the Daily Caller that my advice to the president is he must completely disempower and dismantle Mueller's fraudulent rogue prosecution gang. So to be clear, first, have you spoken to the president about this, and have you specifically told him he should fire Mueller?
Well, I don't believe that that he should fire Mueller, so I would not have told him that, and I haven't told him that. I believe that the president should ignore the incorrect advice of his attorneys, who appear to have told him that he doesn't have the authority to issue directives to the Attorney General of the United States. The Department of Justice is an extension of the executive branch. The president should order the Attorney General, Mr. Sessions, to appoint a special counselor in the matter of Uranium One. That would necessarily put Mr. Mueller, Mr. Comey, Mr. McCabe, and even Mr. Rosenstein under immediate federal investigation. And I cannot see how they could proceed in their current jobs under that circumstance.
All right, well, before we get to the Uranium One, though, I'm a little confused because you wrote he should completely disempower and dismantle Mueller's
I think it would
gang, but
but
now you're saying he shouldn't fire him. So how does he completely disempower and dismantle the prosecution team?
By the appointment of a special prosecutor in Uranium One, my article goes on with the etymology of that scandal. I think it would be impossible for Mueller to proceed. Therefore, I think he would be checkmated, and therefore it would have that effect.
Have you given this advice directly to the president?
I have not.
Tom LoBianco of the Associated Press.
Roger, thanks for doing this. I want to follow up on Steve's opening question. It sounds like you're saying yes to the question of whether there will be some type of charges against the president for whatever the reason, political, legal, justified, what have you. But it does seem like your answer is yes. Is that correct? Is that where we're headed?
Well, that is my concern. That is what I fear. I believe it would be a trumped-up, process-related charge, and given the erosion in public confidence and the exposures about the partisan nature of this inquiry in the last couple of weeks, whether Mr. Mueller could sustain that in the court of public opinion remains to be seen. The president, as you know, has been told by his lawyers that he will get a letter exonerating him on matters pertaining to Russian collusion. First it was by Thanksgiving, then Christmas, then the first of the year. Now I read they're saying February. I just think it underestimates the resolve and the partisan nature of this inquiry. Let me be clear, I don't think the president has committed any crime whatsoever. I think that this is a political proceeding, the first step of a potential coup d'etat based on the deep resentment and enmity for the fact that this president is an outsider and he is pushing a reform agenda that upsets many among the elites in both parties.
Roger, let me hop in on that coup part. So you're working on a book about this, right? The 25th Amendment and the potential for removal of the president. That's correct?
Well, I may be.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, Vanity Fair reported that I was working on a book entitled The Downfall of Donald Trump. I never said that.
Okay.
And I never used those words, and to their credit, they made a correction.
Okay.
If the president is taken down either by Mr. Mueller in what I would consider to be a rogue effort, or in some kind of trumped-up 25th Amendment move, you see Joe Scarborough and Senator Corker and Don Lemon and others increasingly saying he's crazy, he's insane, he's mentally unbalanced. That's all nonsense. He is the same person I've known for 40 years. He's sharp as a tack. He has his own, shall we say, unique style. But you see that as the plan B for the establishment. Now, this is a book I hope that I do not have to write. In fact, my next book, which I have to turn into my publisher on the first of the year, is Stone's Rules, which has nothing to do with this subject, but more a book of maxims that I have kind of delineated through a long career in public life and in politics. So it's a book I hope I don't have to write, but if I did write it, I would title it The Unmaking of the President, and it is based on my concerns. There was some confusion about that piece, but again, I'm merely predicting that this could happen. Again, it's a book I hope I don't have to write.
Have you been questioned or contacted by Mueller's team?
I have not.
They have not reached out to you at all?
No, they have not. I've never, as you know, Mike, because we've talked about this, had any contact with any Russians or those fronting for the Russians. And as I understand it, their charge is looking into collusion by the Russians in the election. Any other questions that they may have pertaining to WikiLeaks or any other matter, they can simply read my extensive under oath statement before the House Intelligence Committee, which I think I addressed all those questions extensively.
Well, the one issue that you didn't address in your testimony to the House was who it was that was your intermediary with Julian Assange when you began tweeting over the summer that WikiLeaks was going to be releasing damaging emails about John Podesta and Hillary Clinton. Now, that individual has since been identified as Randy Credico, a New York comic and radio talk show host. Was he, in fact, the person you were talking to who was giving you a heads up on what Julian Assange was going to be releasing?
Well, that's a mischaracterization of his role. I ultimately did, in a follow-up, supply Mr. Credico's name to the committee. I initially did not do so because I feared professional reprisal against him should his name be known, and indeed he was terminated from his position at WBAI. His role is very narrow, and you'll be familiar with it. He is a confirming source. On July 21st, Assange said in a speech that he had extensive materials on Hillary Clinton and he would publish them. Before that, I included that in my own column and in a broadcast for InfoWars. I wanted a confirmation. He simply confirmed it. Now, to be clear, he didn't tell me the source of Mr. Assange's information, the content or topic of the information. He merely confirmed that WikiLeaks had explosive information on Hillary Clinton, which they would publish, and they did.
How many conversations
Mr. Credico is a journalist, and as you know, I believe Assange is a journalist. I don't see anything improper in any of that, and I ultimately decided to supply that name.
How many conversations did you have with Randy Credico about Julian Assange's intentions about releasing emails relating to Hillary Clinton?
I had multiple conversations, but essentially I had the same conversation multiple times. He told me in late August that this would happen. He told me through September it would happen, through the beginning of October when it, in fact, the material was published.
Let me follow up on your earlier point about the campaign against Robert Mueller and also what we're seeing from the left. You talked about Joe Scarborough. Is there a concerted effort by Fox News, by Sean Hannity, and by some of the president's supporters to discredit Robert Mueller before he comes to any conclusion?
Well, facts are facts. Thanks to the good work of Judicial Watch, thanks to InfoWars and crusading journalists like Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson, Judge Jeanine Pirro, Judge Napolitano, and others, we've learned an extraordinary amount of things. It seems that the folks in the Justice Department were so arrogant that they betrayed their deep animus and hatred for Donald Trump in official emails and tweets and other records, I guess assuming that Hillary Clinton would be elected and they'd be able to cover that all up. So all those folks have done is report the news, and that has supplied some balance because there are certain other news outlets that have ignored some of these significant findings.
Roger, I want to follow up on that question from Steve. I feel like when we were doing when we were covering the campaign, I was at CNN for 2016. I just feel like we never heard about Uranium One. I mean, yes, there was the Clinton Cash book that came out at the very beginning. That made a big splash at the start of this, but then it just disappeared. So what's behind the timing on it? I mean, why didn't we have congressional hearings? Why didn't we see Gowdy at the front of hearings on this back during the campaign when it would have mattered, when it would have had a bigger impact?
I don't think anybody had yet connected the dots. I'm not sure anyone understood that the Clinton Foundation had taken $145 million from 9 separate board members of the company that was acquiring these uranium mining rights. I'm not sure we understood the connection between the $500,000 fee that former President Clinton took from Russian interests connected to this transaction. I'm not sure we understood the entire scope of it. We certainly didn't understand the role of Mr. Mueller, Mr. Comey, Mr. McCabe, and Mr. Rosenstein at that time. Now we do, which is why I laid this out in a long piece for InfoWars and why I've reported on it for the last week. I think that you have, unlike the Russian collusion investigation, you have real evidence of what could be the largest treasonous financial crime in American history.
Michael Isikoff.
Yeah, just following up, and the Uranium One story is a bit complicated, but as I understand it, part of what's new here is the focus on the investigation of bribery and corruption by a Rosatom employee in the United States. And the theory of your case is that Mueller knew about that and therefore should have alerted senior folks in the Justice Department and in the Obama administration about it so that they could have pulled the plug on the Uranium One deal because this was being done by corrupt folks in the Russian government. The guy in charge of that case was Rod Rosenstein, the man who Donald Trump selected as the Deputy Attorney General, the #2 man in his Justice Department. Now, do you have evidence that Rod Rosenstein was deliberately concealing information in order to promote a corrupt Russian takeover of uranium in the United States?
I think that that this was bucked to him as Mr. Mueller hoped to wind it down and take no action. I view the payments to the Clinton Foundation and to Bill and Hillary as bribes as well. They certainly should be seen in that context. So I think it is somewhat ironic that this ended up on Mr. Rosenstein's desk. I must say, yes, I too scratch my head about the appointment of Rosenstein. It's my understanding that he was recommended for this job by Elijah Cummings, the Democratic congressman from Baltimore, and pushed for the job by then White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus. This is an example that I have talked about of the president, in many cases, appointing establishment Republicans who do not have his back, who do not support his agenda for reform, who did not vote for him. And I fear the extent to which he has surrounded himself with quislings, with people who didn't support him, who aren't loyal to him. I am a loyal supporter of the president, and I'm concerned about some of the people that he has perhaps inadvertently put around him.
You have said you don't believe the president should fire Mueller. Do you believe he should fire Rosenstein?
Well, the reason I don't believe he should fire Mueller is because I think that the Democrats realize that they've lost the upper hand in this particular struggle. And therefore, I think they're trying to goad him into this. The Congresswoman Spire saying, rumors are everywhere that the president is going to fire Mueller. Well, only the rumors that you're starting, Congresswoman. They believe that if the president fired Mr. Mueller, say on New Year's Eve or Christmas Day, that they would have the obvious analogies to the Saturday Night Massacre, and therefore the momentum and the public relations argument would flow back to them. The argument would be that Trump fired Mueller to cover up or stop his investigation into misdeeds by the president, rather than Mueller being fired for his obvious bias and lack of objectivity. Again, I think the same thing can be achieved without giving the left that opening. I believe Mr. Mueller can be checkmated.
I think the question was, do you believe he should fire Rosenstein?
I'm going to punt on that. I'm not going to presuppose, but I think normally speaking, special counsels are appointed when there's a crime identified and there's some reason why the Justice Department has a conflict of interest. Recall that Mr. Mueller was appointed by Mr. Rosenstein, not by the Attorney General. Rosenstein's lack of candor, or I should say his dodging and weaving in his congressional testimony was extraordinary. When asked if he could see the obvious bias and partisanship in Mr. Mueller, he said he didn't see it. This guy has all the visual acuity of Stevie Wonder. It's fairly obvious.
Tom LoBianco.
Let me go back to the 25th Amendment here. Do you have any evidence that anyone is actively plotting or attempting or laying the groundwork right now inside the cabinet, inside the administration, to make that removal? Because obviously that would be the mechanism for that to happen. Not people in the Senate, not pundits, not other folks, inside his own White House.
Well, Tom, like you, I have sources and I work my sources, and yes, I believe there are some who have had this discussion. Now, this is both outside the cabinet and in. I think it's the fallback plan for the establishment. That's why I'm trying to sound the clarion call. You're going to see an enormous uptick in these irresponsible stories smearing the president as, non-compos mentis, not up to the job, and so on, particularly if Mr. Mueller should shoot and miss. So I am being realistic about what I believe is the resolve of many in the political establishment to remove the president under any means necessary.
But who are we talking about? Is this the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary, Vice President?
Well, like you, Tom, I cannot reveal those sources, and I'm not prepared to do so. But this is not a conspiracy theory.
I'm not asking you to reveal your sources here, but who are your sources telling you? Who are the people that would be doing this?
There are members of the cabinet who have had this discussion. Let me just leave it at that.
Michael Isikoff.
Can you tell us which cabinet members you're talking about?
No, not at this time. I will probably report that fully at some point. But again, I think that there is a plan afoot that is broader than just the cabinet. Now, the 25th Amendment requires a majority of the cabinet and the vice president. I don't think that's achievable today, not in the heels of the historic tax cut, not on the heels of the disintegration of the credibility of the Mueller investigation. But we have seen what happens when a hysteria is whipped up among the people by some in the mainstream media. And I've always thought this is plan B for the two-party duopoly that has run this country into the ground and deeply resents the election of Donald Trump.
Let me just, on the Russia investigation itself, you referred before to the fact that we've learned a lot about Mueller's team and their partisan biases since he was appointed, but we've also learned a lot about the Trump campaign's contacts with a lot of Russian operatives and Russian representatives that we didn't know a year ago when Donald Trump took office. We learned about the Trump Tower meeting in which the top officials of the Trump campaign were told they were going to be offered derogatory information about Hillary Clinton. We learned about George Papadopoulos, the foreign policy advisor who actually met with Russian cutouts offering dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of thousands of emails. We learned about Jeff Sessions' meetings with the Russian ambassador. We learned about Michael Flynn's contacts with the Russian ambassador. Wouldn't it have been better for the president and his top people to have disclosed all this from the beginning instead of having had this drip out over time and fueling an investigation that has cast a cloud over his presidency?
First of all, I think every one of those contacts that you described turns out to be innocuous, and none of it constitutes collusion, meaning working with the Russians to affect the outcome of the election. Secondarily, we don't know that the president's lawyers haven't disclosed these things. We're not privy to what they have and have not disclosed. Let me be to be clear, Mr. Papadopoulos' emails were turned over to the special counsel by the president's lawyers. So they have done what you say. Papadopoulos, to call him a foreign policy advisor is a little grandiose. He was a volunteer on a 100-member advisory board. He had no authority, and nobody approved his contacts.
Candidate
with
Trump
the Russians.
identified him as a member of his foreign policy team when asked who the members were.
Reading off a press release, yes. As you know, in presidential campaigns, these advisors,
a couple seats down. I mean,
which was a photo op to demonstrate that there was a foreign policy
But my
apparatus.
question was whether or not you think it adds up to anything or not, it certainly has fed the story. So just as a political matter, would it not have been better for the president to have gotten all this out right from the get-go rather than have this drag out over time?
No, I don't think so, because even the most innocent and innocuous contacts are hyped up by the president's opponents to be more than they are. Senator Sessions, now Attorney General Sessions, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Contact between he and the Russian ambassador is neither illegal nor improper, and nothing they discussed, to our knowledge, constitutes to coordination or collusion or conspiracy regarding the election. Look, these contacts get hyped up to be more than they are. Again, no evidence of a crime, no evidence of Russian collusion to affect the outcome of the election.
Final question. Is the president, from your perspective, well served by Secretary of State Tillerson?
Well, the president's a non-interventionist, and I think Tillerson tends to be more of a neocon, and therefore I am disappointed, for example, that we are continuing to be a presence in Afghanistan. The president said during the campaign he would wind that down. We appear to be staying at current levels or maybe even increasing it. But let's be clear, the foreign policy of this administration, at least at this point, still driven by the president, who understands we don't need to march off to any more foreign wars where our inherent national interest is not clear. I have predicted for InfoWars that Secretary Tillerson will be gone near the end of the year, and I stand by that prediction.
Roger Stone joining us from New York. Thank you very much for your time here on Newsmakers.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here.
And we continue the conversation. Michael Isikoff, in terms of the timeline with this Mueller investigation, what are you hearing?
Well, it's not going to wrap up anytime soon. If for no other reason, we have two outstanding indictments of Paul Manafort, the former Trump campaign manager, and Rick Gates, his deputy, and they are going to trial. Trials take a long time to be geared up and to take place. Mueller is certainly not going to wrap up until there's a resolution of the Mueller-Gates matter, and that could be a year or more down the road. We don't know what Michael Flynn is telling the special counsel. We don't know what George Papadopoulos is telling the special counsel. All of those are wild cards that the Trump lawyers can't possibly know the answer to at this point. So I think any hope they might have that there's going to be a rapid wrap-up of Mueller is fanciful at this point.
And Roger Stone's involvement in all of this, his role with the president, what is it, do you think?
Well, I thought it was interesting that he said that Mueller's team has not contacted him because, of course, his tweets suggesting foreknowledge of what Julian Assange was going to do has been one of the Democratic talking points of evidence of possible collusion. Were that the case, one would have expected that Stone would have been questioned already if we take him at his word that he has not been contacted. But I did think it was interesting today that I think he is now confirmed publicly for the first time that Randy Credico, the New York talk show host, was in fact the intermediary who was giving him a heads up on what Julian Assange was going to do.
Making some news today. Tom LoBianco, let me ask you about your book on Vice President Pence and his political future in 2018, his role in the Trump White House as the GOP prepares for the midterms.
Sure. Just a brief breakdown of the book itself will be a political biography of the vice president. So we're going to go all the way back to his days as a child in Columbus, Indiana, through his first two runs for Congress back in 1988 and 1990, his career as a talk radio host in Indy, up through his incredibly successful congressional career right here to the White House, and hit everything in between. You know, look, in terms of where he is in the White House right now, what I hear is that he's a loyal soldier. I have not picked up on anything as of yet about, you know, an effort from him to push Trump out or, you know, fight Trump in any way. There was a big turn. I think we all saw this turn over the summer, the great reporting from the New York Times about the fundraisers that were being held at the Vice President's residence, or not the donors who were being invited. The fundraisers were not actually held on the government property, but donor maintenance. That sparked a sort of a turnabout in terms of the public support from the Vice President for the President. It's an interesting relationship, obviously, perhaps more, shall we say, supportive of the President than you might need to be with other presidents in public. So, you know, look, coming into 2018, there's a big question out there. I hear it from, you know, whenever I'm over in the House, you know, I'm asking about two things, right? I'm asking about Russia and I'm asking about Vice President Pence. These two things are potentially interconnected. If something were to happen, if there is an indictment, if there's a big wave that comes through in 2019, if there's an impeachment, then we have a President Pence.
Yeah, I could just point out, we talked before about the 25th Amendment, and I've talked to scholars of the 25th Amendment who point out that it cannot be invoked under any circumstances without the participation of Vice President Pence. So in order for that to be the route by which President Trump is removed from office, it would require Vice President Pence to push the button.
Wow. That's, I mean, the political peril of all this is just incredible. I feel like we're here at the end of 2017, and I've got this pounding headache from, you know, 1 year of, we thought 2016 would be the end of the political insanity, and it only ramped up. It
only started then.
Happy New Year. Gentlemen, thank you both for being with us on Newsmakers. Merry Christmas. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
And Roger, I promise we're not going to have you take your jacket off to see the tattoo this time.
All right, good. Next time.
Yeah.
A little chilly for that.
Hey, can I ask you a question? When was the last time you talked to Richard Nixon before he passed away?
We were supposed to have dinner the night after he died.
Really? Wow.
So
Night
just before.
Did you have any sense of his own, was he in frail health? Was he in good spirits when you talked to him last time?
No, he was actually in excellent health. He was felled by an unexpected stroke.
Yeah.
But you know, this is a guy who exercised an hour every day before it was popular. Had the same body weight when he was in the Navy that he had at the time of his death.
Wow.
Was ate very carefully and very sparingly, and did an hour of calisthenics every day.
He was supposed to go to China, wasn't he? I know he's on a book tour, but I think he was later that spring. He died in April of '94, right?
Yes, he'd done a couple, you know, he'd done some trips to Russia, but they took a lot out of him. And because of his phlebitis, he couldn't sit for long periods of time on the plane. He had to stroll up and down the aisles to keep his blood flow going. So.
And of course, the death of Pat the year before really devastated him, didn't it?
It hit him very hard.
Yeah.
It's the only time I saw him cry.
Really? Interesting.
Been almost 2 decades now, hasn't it?
More than that. 94 he died, right? April of 94. Wow. So, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
He'd be, he would have been 100. He was born in 1914, 15? Because Kennedy was 17.
14, I think.
Yes, he'd be 103.
Have you seen the paper yet? The movie.
The Post. The Post.
Is it the Post?
No, I've seen the promos for it.
Yeah. You going to see the movie?
But I haven't. Probably.
Yeah.
I have a very long 5,000 word monograph on Bob Woodward that I've been working on for a long time that I'm ready to publish. So.
What's the premise behind it?
That he's full of shit.
You can say that
Surprise,
on TV.
surprise. What can we get away with saying on C-SPAN?
You can say anything you want.
Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, let's keep that in mind.
Why don't we start in 1 minute?
We
So
probably have more recent events to talk about. So
Yeah.